Good morning, everyone. We are looking today at one of the richest and most amazing books in all of Scripture. The prophecies of Isaiah range from beautiful to horrifying, from confusing to comforting, and everywhere in between. There are 66 chapters in this book, and they all feel unique in some way. The book of Isaiah is probably the most messianic book in the Old Testament. Isaiah loves to write about the coming promised king of Israel. And he also radically alters the portrait of this Messiah figure. So you think of the famous suffering servant passage in Isaiah 53. Not many people realized that this was talking about the Messiah and not someone else. So all to say, we could do 50 different videos based on passages in this book. I was debating between about 10 different options when I first started looking into this. But there was one chapter that I just couldn't ignore. So what I want to do today is just read through a passage with you and then ask you to reflect on a few things. This particular word from God is timeless, but I think that right now it's especially timely. This is Isaiah 58, the words of God. Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Okay, so let's walk through this and think about what's going on. God describes the people, and they seem really devout, right? They're coming to God in prayer and fasting regularly. And the people start complaining to God, where's our return on this? We've been fasting and seeking you out, but you aren't coming near or answering our requests. What's the deal? Clearly, they're only doing these things so that God will bless them. Well, God is going to respond to the people. And you might expect that what God is going to say is that the people have become too focused on external things. You've turned this into religion. What I want is relationship. I don't want your displays of fasting. I want internal change, right? Well, that's elsewhere in the Bible, but that isn't what God is going to say right now. Listen carefully. Let's just keep reading. Yet, on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? And now God is going to really paint a picture of what it is he wants to see. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. The people wonder why God isn't responding to their religious rituals, and God doesn't say that what he's looking for is some sort of internal devotion or passion from them. He's looking for true worship. He says, you think you're worshiping me by doing these rituals, but by neglecting these bigger issues of justice, you're actually showing that you don't know me at all. To neglect the vulnerable is to reject God. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because Jesus latches onto this same theme in his own teachings. Jesus quotes from Isaiah all the time. This book really seemed to form the groundwork for his own self-understanding and his mission. And Isaiah 58 specifically is something that pops up a couple different times in his teachings. In Matthew 25, Jesus draws directly from this language when he tells a parable about end times judgment. This is going to sound familiar to you. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Somehow, God and Jesus have this idea that a true relationship with God is reflected in how I respond to issues of justice and need in my community. Somehow Jesus so closely identifies with the poor and the vulnerable that he can say that what you've done to them, you've done to me. Now, how can Jesus say this? How is it that God's worldview plays out in this way? Well, let's just go back to Isaiah 58. This is verse 6 and 7 again. We already read this. God says, "This is the kind of fasting that I want. To loose the chains of injustice, untie the cords of the yoke, set the oppressed free, break every yoke, share your food with the hungry, provide the poor wanderer with shelter. When you see the naked, clothe them, and not turn away from" what? "Your own flesh and blood." These people in need are described as their own flesh and blood. This is family language. God says the oppressed, the hungry, the naked, even the poor wanderer, which implies a foreigner, they are your flesh and blood. There's a core assumption underneath this about humanity, that in the eyes of God, we're all linked together. My flourishing and well-being is intertwined with other people's flourishing and well-being. And this is the bedrock of the biblical view of justice. We don't just care about injustice because it's morally wrong and because that's what Jesus would do. Those things are important and true, but God says, Jesus says, these issues matter because you are all linked together as image bearers of God. God says, because I so radically love and value all of my created children, you as my people are to love and value all of them as well. Whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. Just a few more verses in Isaiah and then we'll wrap up. God says, if you do all this, then you will call and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help and he will say, here I am. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, if you spend your money on behalf of the hungry, oh wait, that's not what it says. If you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry, wow, and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land, and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. And I love these last lines. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. Helping the vulnerable is not just a piece of Christian mission. I think you could make a case that it's at the very core. To love God is to love your neighbor. So just a couple questions for you to think about today. One, why is biblical worship so focused on justice? Based on what we've talked about, and based on other things you've read in the Bible, why is a relationship with God intertwined with a desire for justice in the world? We think of the word worship and we think of singing songs or praising God or praying, the stuff we do in a church worship service. But biblically, worship is much more holistic. It's placing God first and honoring Him, which could look like singing a song, but it could also look like helping your neighbor. So anyway, think about that. That's kind of an intellectual question for you to think about. Here's a more practical one, though. How can you put your worship into action? So think of an injustice that grieves you. Lamenting injustice is important, and we've talked about it a few times already for this series. But the Bible is not just a call for emotional solidarity and sympathy with the vulnerable. It's a call to action. God says in Isaiah, "Will you spend yourself on behalf of those in need?" Now, you may not come up with anything solid right now today, but if nothing else, I just want to plant a vision in your mind of how God calls His followers to act in issues of injustice and corruption. Anyways, Isaiah is so good. Read all of it. Tomorrow, the book of the Bible that we're going to is chosen by our randomizer. Make sure you subscribe to our channel before you leave so that you can get this next video into your feed tomorrow morning. Finally, we're in the book of Psalms. I wondered how long it would take before we would get to this. This will be easy. There's so many great things that we can use for this. All right, we'll see you tomorrow, and I'm going to go pick a psalm that we can look at. Have a wonderful rest of your day.